In 2024, a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford named Leonie Hoff published a paper in the Oxford Journal of Archaeology that quietly overturned an assumption about ancient Egyptian society that had gone essentially unchallenged for more than 2,000 years. Working with a small collection of terracotta figurines pulled from the seafloor off the coast of Egypt, Hoff used a specialized imaging technique to examine faint fingerprints pressed into the clay by the very hands that shaped them, fingerprints left behind sometime between the 7th and 2nd centuries BCE. What those fingerprints revealed directly contradicted the picture handed down through ancient Greek literary sources, which had confidently portrayed figurine making as a job done almost exclusively by men. The fingerprints told a completely different story, one of women working alongside men, and children learning the craft as apprentices right alongside the adults, all contributing to an industry ancient writers had assumed belonged to one gender alone. It is a genuinely small discovery in terms of raw physical size, a handful of clay figures, smalls, enough to fit in your palm, pulled from ruins sitting underwater for well over 1,000 years. But the story behind how those figurines got there, how they were found again, and what science can now extract from the literal fingerprints of the people who made them adds up to one of the more quietly remarkable detective stories in modern Egyptology, one that stretches from a sunken city once dismissed as pure legend all the way to a laboratory measuring the microscopic ridges on human skin. To understand why this particular discovery matters, you first have to understand exactly where these figurines actually came from. And that story begins not in a museum storeroom, but at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. For centuries, a city called Thonis Heracleion existed only as a rumor, a handful of scattered references in the writings of ancient historians like Herodotus and Strabo, who described a magnificent port city sitting at the mouth of the Nile, home to a great temple dedicated to the god Amun, and supposedly the very spot where the Greek hero Heracles first set foot on Egyptian soil. For generations, most scholars assumed the city was little more than myth, an ancient Egyptian equivalent of Atlantis, its existence exaggerated or entirely invented somewhere in the retelling. That changed in the year 2000, when French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team, after years of painstaking underwater surveying in Egypt's Aboukir Bay, finally located genuine physical ruins sitting roughly 4 miles off the modern Egyptian coastline, buried under sediment at a depth of around 30 feet. What Gaudio's team eventually uncovered wasn't simply proof that Thonis Heracleion had existed. It resolved a separate, long-standing puzzle too, since ancient sources sometimes referred to a city called Thonis, and other times to a city called Heracleion, and scholars had long debated whether these represented one settlement or two entirely separate places. Gaudio's excavations settled the question definitively. They were the exact same city, simply known by two different names, one Egyptian and one Greek, reflecting the genuinely cosmopolitan, multicultural character of a port that had spent centuries serving as the primary gateway between the Egyptian and Greek worlds. The story of how Thonis Heracleion actually ended up underwater in the first place is almost as dramatic as its rediscovery. Founded sometime around the 8th century BCE, the city thrived for hundreds of years as Egypt's principal port of entry for anyone arriving from the Mediterranean, a bustling hub of trade, religion, and cultural exchange, until Alexander the Great founded the city of Alexandria, roughly 15 miles to the southwest in 331 BCE. As Alexandria rapidly grew into Egypt's new preeminent harbor, Thonis Heracleion's fortunes gradually declined, and the city, already vulnerable due to sitting on soft, marshy delta soil, began succumbing to a combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and a slow, ongoing process geologists call soil liquefaction, where waterlogged sediment beneath a structure's foundation essentially loses its solidity and behaves more like a thick liquid, causing whatever sits above it to sink. Sometime around the end of the 2nd century BCE, the city's central island, along with its main temples, slid entirely into the sea as the ground beneath it liquefied. The slow decline continued for centuries afterward, and by roughly the 8th century CE, Thonis Heracleion had vanished beneath the waves entirely, leaving behind nothing but scattered fragments of legend until Gaudio's team brought it back into the light exactly 2,000 years later. Frank Gaudio himself brought a genuinely unusual professional background to the discovery, one that reads almost like fiction. Before ever locating Thonis Heracleion, Gaudio had already built a career finding things everyone assumed were lost forever, including, in the late 1990s, the wreckage of Napoleon Bonaparte's flagship, Orient, sunk during the Battle of the Nile against British Admiral Horatio Nelson in 1798, discovered in the very same body of water, Aboukir Bay, where Thonis Heracleion itself would later be found. That earlier success gave Gaudio's team the specialized survey equipment, the institutional credibility, and the sheer patient persistence needed to eventually locate an entire submerged city that generations of earlier archaeologists had considered essentially impossible to find, since, as Gaudio himself later explained, earlier generations of researchers found it almost inconceivable that a genuine archaeological site could exist several kilometers offshore, buried under sediment and open water rather than sand and desert soil. Since that initial 2000 discovery, Gaudio has estimated that his team has managed to excavate and document only around 5% of the entire submerged city, meaning the vast majority of Thaunus Heracleon, including, quite possibly, additional figurines carrying fingerprints from craftspeople whose identities remain entirely unknown still sits buried beneath the Mediterranean seafloor, waiting for future excavation seasons to slowly, patiently bring it back into the light. Colossal stone statues, gold jewelry, ships, coins, and religious offerings, and among that broader haul, excavations conducted in the 1990s and in the years since recovered a modest collection of 60 small terracotta figurines. These weren't grand monumental pieces meant to impress. They were the kind of small, mass-produced devotional or decorative objects an ordinary person in the ancient world might have purchased, owned, or offered at a shrine, some crafted using local Egyptian techniques, others clearly imported from the Greek world, reflecting the same cultural blending that defined the city as a whole. Of those 60 figurines, 9 showed fingerprints well preserved enough for genuine scientific analysis, and it was that specific set of 9 objects that Leonie Hoff, then a doctoral candidate studying the site's non-monumental material culture, decided to examine in detail. It helps to understand exactly what these particular figurines were actually used for, since that context makes the question of who made them even more interesting. Terracotta figurines like the ones Hoff studied served a range of everyday purposes in the ancient world, functioning as household devotional objects, votive offerings left at shrines and temples in hopes of divine favor, and sometimes simply as decorative or even toy-like objects for ordinary domestic use. They were, in other words, humble, mass-produced, relatively inexpensive items, a category of object entirely different from the grand monumental statuary that tends to dominate museum displays and popular imagination about ancient Egyptian art. Precisely because pottery and terracotta work occupied a comparatively low position in the broader hierarchy of ancient craft professions, less prestigious than metalworking, stone carving, or the scribal arts that produced Egypt's famous hieroglyphic texts, potters and figurine makers generally didn't sign their work, weren't named in surviving administrative records with anything like the frequency afforded more elite professions, and left behind essentially no personal testimony about who they were or how their workshops actually operated. That specific combination, a genuinely widespread, economically significant craft industry, paired with an almost complete absence of written documentation about the actual people doing the work, is exactly the kind of historical gap fingerprint evidence is uniquely suited to fill, since it requires no scribe, no inscription, and no elite patron bothering to record a name. It only requires clay, a human hand, and eventually a researcher with the right imaging technology and the patience to look closely enough. And understanding exactly how it works helps explain why the study's conclusions carry real scientific weight, rather than simply being an interesting guess. Hoff's research marked only the second time fingerprint analysis had ever been seriously applied to ancient Egyptian material at all, and the very first time anyone had applied a specific imaging method called reflectance transformation imaging, or RTI, to material from the late and Ptolemaic period specifically. RTI works by capturing a series of photographs of an object's surface under many different lighting angles, then digitally combining those images into a single interactive model that allows a researcher to essentially relight the surface virtually, adjusting the angle of illumination after the fact to reveal microscopic surface details, like the faint, shallow ridges of a fingerprint pressed into clay more than 2,000 years ago that would be essentially invisible under any single, fixed lighting condition. Once Hoff had captured detailed, enhanceable images of the fingerprints on each figurine, she measured 2 specific characteristics of the preserved ridges: their density, meaning how many individual ridges appear within a fixed area of skin, and their breadth, meaning the actual physical width of each ridge. These 2 measurements form the backbone of an established forensic technique, since human finger ridges form permanently before birth, but continue growing wider and less densely packed as a person's fingers grow larger throughout childhood and adolescence. Meaning ridge density and ridge breadth together can reliably estimate a person's approximate age, and with somewhat less certainty their biological sex, based purely on statistical comparisons against large modern reference datasets built specifically for this kind of forensic and archaeological analysis. What Hoff's analysis ultimately revealed directly contradicted the confident centuries-old assumption embedded in ancient Greek literary sources, which consistently described figurine production as a specialized craft dominated by adult male artisans. The fingerprint evidence told a genuinely different story. Hoff's findings pointed to the involvement of men, women, and children in the actual physical production of these figurines, spanning both the locally made Egyptian pieces and the imported Greek-style figurines alike, directly undermining the narrow, male-only picture ancient literary sources had confidently painted. Beyond simply identifying the presence of different ages and sexes among the craftspeople, the fingerprint patterns also offered a genuinely fascinating secondary insight into how these workshops actually function day to day, revealing what appeared to be different stages of training and apprenticeship represented across the sample, physical evidence consistent with a workshop environment where more experienced adult craftspeople worked alongside less experienced children and adolescents who were actively learning the trade, precisely the kind of intergenerational mixed-gender labor structure that written historical sources, composed almost exclusively by and about elite adult men, had simply never bothered to record. Hoff herself was candid about the genuinely preliminary nature of this specific study, given how small the initial sample size remains, describing her hope to eventually locate additional terracotta material at the site capable of expanding and further testing these early conclusions. An honest acknowledgement that good archaeological science treats even a genuinely compelling finding as the opening of a new line of inquiry rather than a final, closed verdict. This particular study did not emerge from nowhere, and it sits within a small but genuinely growing body of research, applying modern fingerprint forensics to ancient Egyptian material more broadly, each new study adding another small piece to a picture written history left almost entirely blank. Decades earlier, researchers studying terracotta Shabti figures, small funerary, statuettes meant to serve as magical servants for the deceased in the afterlife, recovered from the Deir el-Medina necropolis and linked to an Egyptian priest of Amun named Nesbai-Herhat, noticed faint lines along the sides of the statues that, after closer inspection, turned out to be fingerprints left behind during the original molding process. Analysis of those prints allowed researchers to determine which specific fingers and which hand the ancient craftsman had used while shaping different parts of each individual statue, offering an almost unbearably intimate window into the exact physical motions of someone working with wet clay well over 3,000 years ago. More recently, in 2025, curators at Cambridge's Fitzwilliam Museum made a separate, genuinely striking discovery while preparing artifacts for an exhibition called Made in Ancient Egypt. Examining the underside of a clay object called a soul house, a small model dwelling roughly 4,000 years old that would have been placed in a tomb to hold food offerings for the deceased, conservators found a remarkably complete handprint. Not just a partial fingerprint, but an entire palm and full set of fingers pressed into the clay base. Senior curator and Egyptologist Helen Strudwick described the discovery in genuinely moved terms, saying she had never seen such a complete handprint on any Egyptian object before, and that seeing something like this brings you very close to the specific person who left their mark on it so long ago. Researchers believe the print was left entirely unintentionally by the potter simply picking up the still damp object to carry it out of the workshop for drying before firing. A completely mundane, unthinking gesture from an ordinary workday that nonetheless survived intact across 4,000 years. Taken together, these separate discoveries, the Deir el-Medina Shabti prints, the Fitzwilliam Soul House, handprint, and now Hoff's detailed analysis of the Thonis Heraclean figurines point toward a genuinely underappreciated truth about how ancient Egyptian craft objects actually get studied and understood. For most of the history of Egyptology as a formal discipline, researchers focused overwhelmingly on inscriptions, monumental art, and the textual record left behind by scribes and elites, sources that consistently centered the activities, achievements, and social position of adult men, particularly wealthy or powerful ones, while remaining almost entirely silent on the actual identity of the ordinary craftspeople who physically produced the huge volume of everyday objects filling Egyptian households, workshops, and tombs. Pottery specifically occupied a genuinely low rung on the social ladder in ancient Egypt, and evidence suggests potters may have held lower social status than many other categories of craftsperson. One likely reason so little historical documentation survives naming or describing the actual people who did this specific kind of work. Fingerprints, precisely because they are an entirely unintentional, physically unavoidable byproduct of simply touching wet clay with bare hands, bypass that entire historical silence completely. Nobody making a figurine or a soul house was trying to leave a permanent record of their own identity for future archaeologists to study. They were just doing their job, and the accidental physical evidence of that ordinary labor survived anyway, protected and preserved by the exact same firing process that hardened the clay into the durable ceramic archaeologists eventually recovered thousands of years later. The broader forensic science underlying all of this work has itself continued advancing rapidly, and it connects directly to genuinely cutting-edge developments in how modern researchers extract identity and even genetic information from ancient Egyptian remains and objects more generally. Developments that increasingly combine physical evidence with molecular biology in ways earlier generations of archaeologists could never have imagined. One of the most striking examples of this broader trend involves not a fingerprint at all, but DNA, and it resolved a genuine decades-old Egyptological mystery using techniques originally developed for entirely different purposes. Since 1915, when the severed head of a mummy was discovered inside a looted tomb at the ancient necropolis of Deir el-Bersha, Egyptologists had been able to determine, through careful study of accompanying inscriptions, that the tomb belonged to a provincial governor named Jehutnakht and his wife, but they had never been able to determine, with any real confidence, whether the specific severed head recovered from the tomb actually belonged to the governor himself or to his wife. Rita Fried, a curator at Boston's Museum of Fine Arts, which has held the tomb's contents since 1920, summarized the puzzle bluntly, admitting researchers simply never knew for certain whether they were looking at Mr. or Mrs. Jehutnakht. That century-old uncertainty was finally resolved using cutting-edge forensic genetics, when researchers enlisted the FBI's own forensic laboratory to extract usable DNA directly from one of the mummy's teeth, applying exactly the same kind of molecular identification techniques the Bureau normally uses to solve modern criminal cases, successfully determining the individual's identity and closing a genuinely open Egyptological question that had sat unresolved for well over 100 years. That specific case illustrates something genuinely important about where this entire field is heading: the increasing convergence of forensic science, originally developed almost entirely for solving modern crimes, with the study of some of humanity's oldest surviving physical evidence. Fingerprint ridge analysis, the exact technique Leonie Hoff applied to the Thonis Heraclean figurines, and DNA extraction, the technique that finally identified the Deir el-Bersha mummy head, both represent forms of biological evidence that ancient people left behind entirely without intention, evidence that exists independently of whatever a society's written records chose to preserve or omit. And both techniques have benefited enormously from the same broader wave of computational and technological advancement reshaping nearly every corner of modern science, from the imaging software that allows a researcher like Hoff to digitally relight a 2,000-year-old clay surface from any angle imaginable, to the increasingly sensitive laboratory techniques capable of successfully extracting a usable genetic sample from a single ancient tooth. Statistical and machine learning approaches, similar in spirit to the tools modern forensic scientists use to estimate a living suspect's age and sex from a crime. Scene fingerprint increasingly underpin exactly this kind of archaeological ridge analysis too, comparing ancient measurements against enormous modern reference datasets to generate genuinely defensible, statistically grounded conclusions rather than mere guesswork. What makes the Thonis Heraclean discovery specifically so quietly powerful, beyond the genuine methodological achievement involved, is exactly whose story it manages to recover. Ancient Greek writers, the same tradition that gave us so much of what survives about daily life in the classical Mediterranean world, confidently described figurine making as work belonging to men, and for more than 2,000 years, nobody had any physical evidence capable of directly challenging that confident, if quietly unsupported, assumption. The people who might have corrected the record, the women and children who apparently worked alongside men in these ancient workshops, left behind no inscriptions, no name biographies, nothing in the historical record identifying them individually or as a group. They left behind only their fingerprints, pressed unknowingly into wet clay, protected by an accident of firing and burial, and eventually by centuries spent underwater, waiting for a technology capable of finally reading what those prints actually recorded. Hoff's research doesn't just add a small technical correction to the archaeological record. It restores, in a genuinely direct, physical, undeniable way, an entire category of ancient laborers, women and children specifically, back into a historical narrative that had confidently and incorrectly written them out entirely, based on nothing more than a handful of surviving texts written by men who apparently never bothered to look closely at who was actually shaping the clay in the workshops around them. The broader trajectory of this kind of research points toward tools becoming increasingly sophisticated with each passing year, and increasingly reliant on the same computational advances, transforming forensic science more generally. Modern forensic laboratories studying living suspects now routinely use machine learning models, trained on enormous reference databases to estimate a person's age, sex, and even likely physical appearance directly from fingerprint ridge patterns recovered at crime scenes, refining decades of manual, caliper-based measurement into something closer to a fully automated statistical prediction. As those same computational techniques continue filtering into archaeological research, the kind a preliminary 9-figurine sample Hoff worked with in her original 2024 study could eventually be processed at a scale simply impossible for a single researcher working by hand, cross-referencing measurements across hundreds or even thousands of ancient objects simultaneously, potentially revealing patterns of ancient labor organization, workshop structure, and apprenticeship far more detailed than what any individual scholar could currently piece together figurine by figurine. That future remains a work in progress rather than a present reality, but the direction of travel is already clear, and it echoes the same trajectory that turned a chance discovery in a Kenyan lake bed or a single Neanderthal fingerprint on a Spanish river stone into genuine, statistically rigorous science, rather than mere archaeological curiosity. Given everything else about Thonis Heracleon's own improbable story, a city dismissed for centuries as pure myth, an ancient Egyptian Atlantis existing only in second-hand fragments of Herodotus and Strabo, was proven real through patient, technologically sophisticated underwater archaeology. And now, more than 2 decades after that initial rediscovery, a small collection of unremarkable clay figurines pulled from that same sunken city has managed to correct a historical record that had stood essentially unquestioned since antiquity, not through the discovery of some new written text or inscription naming names, but through the simple, accidental, entirely unintentional act of human beings pressing their bare fingers into wet clay while doing their ordinary jobs more than 2,000 years ago, never imagining anyone would ever be able to read what they had left behind. It took a sunken city, a specialized imaging technique invented for entirely different purposes, and a small handful of overlooked artifacts sitting quietly in an archive for years before anyone thought to look closely enough. But the fingerprints eventually spoke anyway, and what they said finally corrected a 2,000-year-old assumption that nobody, until Leonie Hoff, had ever actually had the physical evidence to properly challenge. And the story likely isn't finished either, with roughly 95% of Thonis Heracleon still sitting unexcavated beneath the Mediterranean seafloor, and with Hoff herself explicitly hoping to expand her original 9-figurine sample as more terracotta material surfaces in future excavation seasons. The fingerprints still waiting to be found in that sunken city may well end up revealing even more about exactly who built, shaped, and sustained one of the ancient world's great cosmopolitan trading ports, one accidental, perfectly preserved handprint at a time.